Good evening. My name is Alan Gould. I'm the Executive Director of the Drinko Academy here at Marshall. And on behalf of the Academy and the Marshall community, it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's presentation celebrating the 254th anniversary of the birth of our namesake, the great Chief Justice John Marshall. Ladies and gentlemen, it is now my pleasure to present to you the Marshall University Fife and Drum Corps for the posting of the colors. Would you please stand? It is now my pleasure to present to you our one and only Linda Dobbs, who will lead us in the singing of the Star Spangled Banner. So proud I want to take this opportunity to thank the Corps and to also announce to you that once they put up their instruments, they will come back and be seated among you at various tables so they can also, as honored guests, enjoy our Federalist Supper. And it'll give you, some of you, the opportunity to interact and chat with some very, very fine Marshall students. And it's now my esteemed pleasure to present to you our president, Dr. Stephen Kopp, who will give some opening remarks.
Thank you, Alan, and a hearty good evening to everyone. Welcome to the celebration of John Marshall's birthday. We owe thanks to a great many people who have been responsible for the planning and arrangements for this evening's event. Noteworthy among them are Dr. Alan Gould, who is the director of the John Deaver Drinko Academy, James Morris Smith, Deb Carter Deem, and Renee Denny. Please give them our thanks. Thank you, too, to Professor Wendell Dobbs and the members of the John Marshall Fife and Drum Corps for their contributions to this evening's festivities. We also owe an eternal debt of gratitude to John and Libby Drinko for establishing the John Deaver Drinko Academy here at Marshall University. The Academy is the principal sponsor of this evening's event. The Academy is devoted to enhancing public understanding of American institutions and the responsibilities of citizens to their society, particularly our sense of shared values and common purpose. Recognizing and celebrating the birth of a truly great American, our namesake, John Marshall, certainly fits well within the mission of the Academy. If you will indulge me for a few moments, I will set the stage for this evening's birthday party. John Marshall was born in 1755 in a simple wooden cabin in what was to become Fauquier County at the foot of the Blue Ridge Mountains, then on the remote reaches of the Virginia's northwest frontier. Marshall's brief formal education began at age 14 when his father sent him to Campbelltown Academy in Westmoreland County, Virginia, for 1 year. There he developed proficiency in basic skills and an introduction to Latin. Eventually, Marshall mastered Greek and Latin and read the classics, and later briefly studied law at William and Mary. John Marshall joined the Revolutionary War in the summer of 1755 when he arrived at the muster field for the Culpeper Militia located near Germantown in Fauquier County. He walked 10 miles to get there from the family home at Oak Hill, a young, lanky 19-year-old frontiersman who came with high resolve, appeared wearing a purple-dyed hunting shirt, a beaver hat, tomahawk hung at his side, and a rifle in his hand. He soldiered under General George Washington and was present at Valley Forge during that awful winter. And like so many other young men who fought in the war for American independence, Marshall became an ardent nationalist. He embraced America as his country and Congress as his government, and did so to such an extent that they became a part of his very fabric of his being. Following his service to our young nation, Marshall settled in Richmond, Virginia, where he practiced law, and he and his wife, the former Mary Ambler, affectionately known as Polly, raised their family. After declining multiple state and federal appointments, President John Adams nominated Marshall to the U.S. Supreme Court as the fourth Chief Justice in 1801. John Marshall became the longest-serving Chief Justice in the United States history. His fame, however, was not derived from the length of his service. It emanated from what he accomplished as Chief Justice. Marshall transformed the Constitution from a mere compact of the 13 states into a national union, and created an ascendant role for the Supreme Court at the very epicenter of our new nation's development. John Marshall was a great man in an era that brought forth great men, men for the ages. His tenure spanned the terms of 5 presidents: Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, James Monroe, John Quincy Adams, and Andrew Jackson. Under Marshall's leadership, the Supreme Court became a powerful force for justice, the rights of the common man, and a dominant force in American life. A recounting of Chief Justice Marshall's landmark decisions reads like a primer on American constitutional law. During his 35-year tenure, his leadership solidified the court, elevating and establishing its rightful role as the just and final interpreter of the law, as defined by the Constitution. Through his leadership, the court achieved independence and equality with the other branches of the federal government. During Marshall's stewardship as Chief Justice, the Supreme Court rendered decisions in 1,182 cases. Of these cases, 1,104 were unanimous opinions. By majority decision, known as the opinion of the court, the justices spoke with one voice, and usually that voice was Marshall's. He wrote over half of those decisions. Marshall established the authority of the Supreme Court. He converted it from a weak and fragmented body into the custodian of constitutional legitimacy and the Constitution as the law of the land. Today, that authority is taken for granted, but it was neither universally recognized nor accepted in 1801. During his tenure as Chief Justice, Marshall gave the court leadership that has never been replicated. He was blessed with a superbly incisive mind, an ability to listen, and a quick, eloquent pen. He was not domineering, but humorous, unpretentious, and open. A Chief Justice who led by consent and who extracted the best from each of his colleagues. In that respect, the warmth of his personality was as important as the clarity of his intellect. The broad powers of the federal government, the absolute role of the court, which created a legal environment conducive to the growth of the nation and its economy, stem from the decisions that flowed from Marshall's pen. Over time, John Marshall became deeply rooted in Richmond's rich and varied social life. He was a charter member of the city's famous Quoits Club, where he was not only a formidable competitor, but also the chief judge of disputed points. The club was also famous for its lavish barbecue picnics and a potent punch concocted by Marshall containing brandy, rum, and Madeira, poured into a bowl 1/3 filled with ice and sweetened with lemons added for garnish. Marshall University professor Gene Edward Smith has written that three statesmen, above all others, forged the American Republic. George Washington, who founded it, Abraham Lincoln, who preserved it, and John Marshall, who defined it. John Marshall died at 6 o'clock on the evening of July 6, 1835. He was 79 years old. His final words were a prayer for the Union. On July 8, 1835, as the Marshall funeral cortege moved slowly through the streets of Philadelphia, muffled bells reverberated the solemn message. Then suddenly the great Liberty Bell in Independence Hall went silent. It had cracked while tolling the death of the great Chief Justice. It never tolled again. John Marshall was buried next to his beloved Polly at the Shockoe Hill Cemetery in Richmond. The words on his gravestone were written by Marshall 2 days before he died, leaving nothing but the final date to be affixed. The modest inscription reads, John Marshall, son of Thomas and Mary Marshall, was born the 24th of September, 1755. Intermarried with Mary Willis Ambler, the 3rd of January, 1783, departed this life the 6th day of July, 1835. John Marshall's modesty, so apparent in all that he did and said, stemmed from a quality rare among the great men of the early republic. He was genuinely a modest man. The more famous he became, the more modest he grew. Tonight, we celebrate the birthday of John Marshall, our namesake. And we are blessed to have you in attendance this evening and blessed by a very special guest this evening who all of us will come to know and understand and, in my opinion, honor by his presence. and that is the great Chief Justice John Marshall, who is with us this evening, and you will hear more from him after dinner. Enjoy the Federalist Supper. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. I just wish that all of our students and our faculty and staff knew as much about John Marshall as our president does. Someday that might happen if we keep working at it. Thank you very much. I believe it's appropriate at this moment to thank the sponsors of this evening's celebration. First, I want to recognize President Kopp for his support, not only of this event, but of all of our celebration of Constitution Week. And to second a person he identified earlier, our benefactor, Dr. Elizabeth Drinko, also for her generous support. So again, let's give them both a round of applause. Parenthetically, our celebration continues tomorrow with the ceremonial cutting of John Marshall's birthday cake. Now, it's no ordinary cake. Its dimensions are 4 feet by 8 feet, and the cake will be served tomorrow beginning at 11 a.m. on the plaza in front of the Student Center. It will be ceremoniously cut by President Kopp and Mr. Sean Hornbuckle, the president of our student body. And the public is encouraged and invited to attend. Also, we will have the finals of our quoits tournament. Quoits was the favorite game of John Marshall, and for the uninitiated, it's a game similar to modern horseshoes. I think it's a very special interest to know that Dr. Kopp will field a team in the President's Invitational Tournament. And based upon past experience, I know the competition is going to be fierce. Our president doesn't like to lose. So I enjoy and encourage all of you to come out and have some quoits and some cake here on the campus. Now, we have decided to forego the usual recognition of distinguished guests in our audience this evening. To us, you're all very special and important people, worthy of introduction. And knowing John Marshall's predilection for informality, I know he would have wanted it this way. So thank you for coming. Thank you for your attention. Please enjoy your Federalist Supper, and the remainder of our program will follow dinner. Thank you. Enjoy. Now, the Fife and Drum Corps, in its brief period of existence, just over about 2 years, has more than fulfilled its major objectives, bringing honor and recognition to our namesake, John Marshall, and serving as ambassador of goodwill for this university. So now it is my pleasure to present you the director of the Fife and Drum Corps for a very special presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Private Dobbs.
Thank you, Dr. Gould. I am ubiquitous. The John Marshall Fife and Drum Corps has completed 2 full years of operation. We have performed many times in many places, culminating in a highly successful trip to New York City. There we are at Times Square. Just several weeks ago, when the Corps performed for a capacity crowd at the National Flute Association's annual conference at the Marriott Marquis Hotel at Times Square. Immediately before us in the audience, as April Bennett will attest, was none other than Sir James Galway, who had just been honored with the association's Lifetime Achievement Award. He was busy, as was the rest of the audience, frantically taking photographs of the phenomenon that is the John Marshall Fife and Drum Corps. At this moment, thank you. I would like to thank my colleague and wife, Linda Dobbs, for her essential and heartfelt support of me and the Corps. Thank you. Now I would like to recognize some of our members who will now be leaving the Corps. It's a natural part of college football and Fife and Drum Corps that members serve and then move on to the next chapter in their lives. However, we do want that these emeritae not to leave without expressing our appreciation. First, we have two drummers who are leaving us, Andrew Tilley and Levi Billiter. Andrew served as the drumline leader in our first year, and Levi in the second. They've become renowned for their spectacular drum breaks during our shows. They are both graduates of our music education program, and they are both planning to pursue graduate studies. Levi, as a special favor to me, is performing with the Corps this evening. As a teacher of flute, I felt well equipped to teach the fife. However, having no background in percussion, I would have been at a total loss without the professionalism and creativity of these two superbly trained and talented percussionists. I will present the certificates for both to Levi, and many thanks. Levi, where are you? Lance Arthur was a graduate student in our music history program this past year, an excellent flutist, and he was also an excellent member. He has entered the Holy Cross Theological Seminary in Boston. Rebecca Harrison has served for 2 years as our drill writer. She used the expertise she learned from our director of bands, Steve Barnett, to create the fabulous precision drills that have been a hallmark of the Corps for the past 2 years. She is a Trinity choral scholar and is there rehearsing this evening. I would like to ask Levi Billiter to convey these greetings to Rebecca along with our thanks. Callie Huff is a graduate student in our music education program. There are not enough words to express what a wonderful and helpful individual Callie is. She is equal part excellent as a performer and professional. She'll be greatly missed. I initially had plans for a graduate assistant for the Corps, but we were unable to identify a graduate student who was not already committed to other duties. Elizabeth Ford stepped forward and filled these shoes. Elizabeth had just completed a master's degree in musicology at Johns Hopkins University, so she was not interested in being a graduate student, but she found our developing Corps an interesting proposition and invested an enormous amount of time and energy in its operation. She carried out the initial research on many of our appearances, making the appropriate arrangements with presenters and organizers, and she offered excellent advice on the functioning of the Corps. She wrote an article about the Corps that was published in the Instrumentalist Flute Talk magazine. New York was her final engagement with us. She has followed in her father's steps and has entered the law school at West Virginia University. Robert Heath has served these past 2 years as drum major of the Corps. A finer, more responsible individual cannot be found. His judgment in leading the Corps through complicated maneuvers is second to none. He's able to make split-second decisions that are spot on, and he is unflappable in stressful situations. I've greatly enjoyed his gregarious and kind nature, and his leadership will be greatly missed. Robert was a political science major and also a music performance major in clarinet, receiving 2 degrees. He intends to pursue his music in the United States Army. Where are you, Robert? And let me take this opportunity to thank all of the members of the John Marshall Fife and Drum Corps, both past and present, for their unswerving support and membership in the Corps. It's been my honor to lead you, and I'm looking forward to more exciting opportunities for all of us. Now, one final acknowledgement. Larry Ford and his wife Karen live in South Charleston. They are the parents of Elizabeth Ford, about whose contributions to the Corps I already told you. Larry is an attorney in the firm Meyer, Ford & Glasser. Larry and Karen have attended many of our events, cheering us on, especially in downtown Charleston parades. Larry was very helpful in raising the funds necessary for our trip in August to New York City. Karen has prepared lunches for the Corps on those occasions when we had to leave very early in the morning to arrive in time for our engagements. Most importantly, they have supported Elizabeth in her work with the Corps, making sure Vlad, the family Volvo, was available for trips to Huntington for rehearsals and performances. They have taken more than just a passing interest in the Corps, and their support has been above and beyond the call of duty. For these reasons, we take great pleasure in making them honorary members of the Corps, as proclaimed in this document signed by President Kopp and Dr. Gould. As a sign of their membership, we would like to issue them official John Marshall Fife and Drum Corps tricorn hats, upon which is affixed our official John Marshall signet and green cockade. Could you please come forward, please? Originally, we thought about awarding Larry with an S-Pontoon, but we thought that an S-Pontoon in the hands of a lawyer might be a threat to due process. So we thought better of that. So, is that true? Thank you very much, and thank you all for supporting us and having us here. It's a great honor to perform for you.
John Marshall became Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in February 1801, appointed by John Adams, and he served in that capacity for 34 years, earning the titles the Great Chief Justice and the Expounder of the Constitution. But as some here may not know, before his court appointment, he also served in a number of other capacities, some of them mentioned earlier in the President's remarks. He served as a Revolutionary War soldier, and as we know, soldiered with Washington at Valley Forge. He has also served in the Virginia State Legislature. He was a delegate to the pivotal 1788 Virginia Constitutional Convention. He served as United States envoy to France in the famous XYZ affair, as a congressman leading the moderate wing of the Federalist Party, and as Secretary of State in the cabinet of President John Adams. Tonight, we will journey back in time to the fall of 1807. In a moment, we will meet Chief Justice Marshall, who has come over the beautiful mountains of Virginia to be with us this evening after finishing a very difficult session in the Federal Circuit Court at Richmond. No doubt he will talk about various subjects to us of public interest, including the recent treason trial of Aaron Burr. We might also expect him to draw upon his military experience to share his views on the future of the federal judiciary and the American nation. Perhaps we will discover some of the reasons for the well-known disagreements, and I use that term mildly, between himself and his famous cousin, Thomas Jefferson. And perhaps we will learn why John Marshall exchanged a lucrative career as an appellate lawyer Some argue that he was the most outstanding attorney in the Commonwealth of Virginia for the arduous journey into national politics and jurisprudence. I would remind all here in the audience, our visitor from the past will know nothing of the future. Judge Marshall may ask you questions, and he will be glad to receive them, as long as the inquiries are appropriate to the era of the fall of 1807. An opportunity for modern questions and discussions will follow the role-playing vignette. Now let's go back in time to 1807 and see what we can learn from an esteemed fellow Virginian, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, the Honorable John Marshall. Welcome.
Ladies and gentlemen, I cannot tell you how delightful it has been to make new friends with each conversation this evening. I do not often get this far west into the mountains of Virginia, and to have the opportunity to engage in conviviality and social activities with so large a number of people has been a great delight to me. In fact, I wish to offer a toast, if I may. And at this time, if any of you have any glasses that are properly charged with some liquid article, I encourage you to find it, and I give you the following toast. To the people and the communities in the western mountains of Virginia. They are brave soldiers in time of war. They are good neighbors in time of peace. And they are intelligent citizens at all times. Hear, hear. I think those who know me best know that it is my annual custom between meetings of the Circuit Court to come out in the hot summer months and gallop off to the Blue Ridge and leave the Tidewater behind in search of rest and relaxation. And I have spent my early life in the country places, and I enjoy going back to them. And yet you will remark that this is not the summer, it is the fall in this fine year of 1807, and so it is an unusual sight to see me this far west at this time of year. But I can assure you, I have ample reason to be here now. I have been fatigued and occupied with the most unpleasant case which has ever been brought before a judge in this country. I am speaking, of course, of the recent trial of former Vice President Aaron Burr on the charge of treason. This was a most deplorably serious subject. I might have made it less serious for me if I had been willing to follow the public will and obey the public clamor instead of obeying the public law. But I feel now, and always will feel, that it is the duty of a judge to be uninfluenced by popular clamor or even party favor. We must be always guided by the law. And so I have attempted to be guided by the law in the proceedings against Mr. Burr. Let us be clear that no man should be deprived of his life without access to the law. And we were under very difficult circumstances in the Capitol at Richmond, Virginia. The trial lasted for several months, and important questions came before the court, some of them without precedent. I wonder, as far west as we are here this evening, how many of the details of the Burr trial may have caught up with you here in these remote parts. Have you been following it? Have you heard much about it? Some of you have. Would it be fair to say that perhaps it would be helpful to say a few more points on the connection in the case? Indeed. Well, several points came before the court. The most important is, what definition of treason should operate in American courts? there is a European tradition of defining treason rather broadly. It is a constructive doctrine. In the courts on the other side of the Atlantic, it may be possible to charge someone with treason who may have only been thinking about doing it or making statements to the effect that wouldn't be interesting if such an event were to take place. But we had to consider if that was a viable doctrine in the consideration of treason on this side of the Atlantic. And consulting our Constitution, the answer was clear. It states that in order to convict on treason, you must produce not one, but two witnesses, oculantis testis, eyewitnesses, to not hearsay or mere conversation, but to an overt act. That is the standard of proof the Constitution requires to take a man's life. In the end, the prosecution was unable to provide two such witnesses. Another question that came before the court: can a defendant subpoena a sitting executive of this country? Mr. Burr was willing to find out. And it was clear that Mr. Jefferson, President of the United States, was in possession of a letter which appeared to be quite material to the proceedings of this court, the Federal Circuit Court in the 5th District. So, what is the proper mode of proceeding? We decided that it was possible to subpoena a sitting president for evidence relevant in a case. That brings up a new question. Who has the authority to decide whether the president should respond to the subpoena? It is my belief that a court which reviews the evidence in private and decides that there is no risk to the nation in disclosing the evidence has the power to see that evidence produced in court so that justice may be obtained. Mr. Jefferson had a different view of the subject. He claimed it was the complete prerogative and privilege of the executive alone to decide whether or not the evidence requested need be produced to the federal court. Well, you may wonder, what was the outcome of this difference of opinion? We don't yet know. The president decided, rather than appearing in person, it would be sufficient to the cause of justice to provide the letter itself to the court. And this was done. And it was an important piece of evidence in arriving at a conclusion. Interesting questions indeed. It's a jury trial. And when all was said and done, the jury returned a verdict. We, the jury, find the defendant, Aaron Burr, not proved to be guilty, according to the evidence shown us in court. An extraordinary verdict. But that is how it was returned. It will stand on the order books of the court as not guilty. It is always our duty to pursue law without reference to politics whenever possible, especially in our conduct as judges. When it comes to the federal judiciary, which I now have the honor to be a part of, it is clear that Mr. Jefferson and I have considerable differences of opinion on what the proper role and jurisdiction of the federal judiciary should be. What is the purpose of a federal judiciary? It is to see to the peaceable and orderly execution of the laws. Why do we trust our judges? Because of the manner of their appointment and because of the tenor of their offices. I have heard it said that Mr. Jefferson feels that there is a dangerous oligarchy to be found in the federal judiciary as it now exists. But I remind Mr. Jefferson and any other enemies of the court, what is first necessary for someone like me to come to the bench? We must have the agreement and concurrence of both the executive branch and the legislative branch. It is the province of the President to nominate, and it is the duty of the U.S. Senate to confirm or not to confirm a judge to the court. So, as I stand here as Chief Justice, it is with the agreement and concurrence of the other two branches of government. That should give all citizens a greater sense of trust in the judiciary. We are not kings. We are not oligarchs. And I hasten to point out that the Constitution is as much a guide and control on the judiciary as it is upon the executive and the legislative branches. Again, that should give comfort to our citizens. It is the very essence of civil liberty that whenever a citizen receives an injury, he should be able to apply to the courts for redress. If ever a law be tyrannically administered by the executive branch, to what other part of the government can you turn with greater confidence and hope than to the judiciary? That is among our many weighty duties. There's another question. Whose interpretation of the law has precedence? The federal courts or the state courts? There are those who argue for concurrent jurisdiction, that whenever a perplexing question of a constitutional nature may arise, that any state court may make a pronouncement of equal value and validity as a federal court. I cannot entertain this interpretation. It is manifestly impracticable. There must be a final arbiter somewhere. And when the friends of Mr. Jefferson suggest that there can be as many different interpretations of our foundational document as there are courts considering the Constitution, then I am forcibly reminded that Mr. Jefferson's genius lies in being a speculative philosopher and not so much in being a practicable statesman. If we have differing views on the jurisdiction of federal courts and the primacy of federal opinions on national questions involving our Constitution, it is fair to admit that Mr. Jefferson and I have differing opinions of the nature of the Constitution itself. One of Mr. Jefferson's more original and peculiar theories is that society would be well served if, by his calculations, we throw out constitutions every 19 years and start from fresh. Now, I ask you, do you feel any sense of security for your rights, your liberties, your property, if every 19 years the fundamental law will be thrown out and redesigned? Not practicable. There is another question. If the Constitution should not be dissolved every 19 years, might it be changed nonetheless? Well, of course. We have an article in that document which expressly provides for a formal and official manner of amendment. And in so doing, from time to time, guided by actual experience and not theory, it can be hoped that our Constitution will be adaptable to meet every crisis in human affairs. Let me give you some idea of my conception of the federal Constitution. I say that the greatest improvement on political institutions that America has given the world is the example of a written Constitution. You have heard much of the British Constitution. In fact, we have drawn some of our general principles from it. But you may live in London the rest of your life, and you may visit every archive and every government office, and you may request British officials to produce for you a copy of the vaunted and venerated British Constitution. Can they produce a copy? Nay, it has never been set down on paper. Remarkable to relate. But we have done so. I firmly believe that our federal Constitution is the political rock of our foundation as a nation. It is intended to endure for ages to come. Why? Because it is the original and supreme expression of the will of the people, a will to be a nation. Now, this does strike terror into the hearts of certain friends of Mr. Jefferson. But I ask you plainly, is the term American people odious? Is the phrase national government fearful? It is simple to remind ourselves of the proverb Aristotle tells. United, we are strong. Divided, we are weak. There are other governments on the other side of the ocean who would look with jealous interest upon our progress, and I have no doubt they would rejoice if we succumbed to the theories of the speculative philosophers who would, if the power be equal to their will, become the architects of dismemberment for our nation. I pray it will never come to that. Too much blood, too much money, too much property, time, and lives have been sacrificed for something far greater than a mere league of states. We had that once. Who here amongst you can forget one of the most instructive periods in the history of our nation? The revolution for our independence. It was then I found myself drawn into the Army, and I was proud and remain proud to be a son of Virginia. But as I served at Valley Forge and in the field on campaign and in the camp, I was thrown into close contact with other young men who would be proud to be from Pennsylvania. They were proud to be from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. They were proud to be from other points. And what I soon discovered was that all of these young men were willing to hazard everything most dear, life itself, if need be, in the pursuit of a just cause, bigger than any of us and bigger than any of our localities. It is then forged in the crucible of war that I came to understand that my country was America and my government was Congress. And as to the state governments, their inability to adequately provide for and sustain the soldiers in the field wearing the uniforms that you see here amongst yourselves this evening was testimony to the inadequacy of existing governmental forms. A league of states would not do. Something more was required. If we aspire to be a nation accorded respect in the world, we must remember that the true definition of a government is an entity which can carry out the responsibilities given to it by using its own means. That is a real government. And for those who are diligent and watchful as to the new powers granted under our federal Constitution, let us remind ourselves, when the power is granted, is it necessary to achieve the ends stipulated? And is that power granted well guarded? And here is the essence of the genius of our system. How many parts are there to our federal government? You know the three branches well. Legislative, executive, and judicial. I remind you that an upright, virtuous, and wise judiciary is absolutely necessary to maintain not only the separation of powers, but the rule of law itself. If we become the mere creatures of politics, if we become the mere tools of the executive or of the legislative, there will be no proper separation of powers. That is the plain truth. And as a further illustration of the wisdom of an independent judiciary, let us remind ourselves of that interesting document, the Declaration of Independence, written, it must be admitted, in large part, by my Virginia cousin. Did he not himself point out the dangers of a king who made the judges and the courts dependent on his will alone for the tenure of their offices and the amount and payment of their salaries? This is no separation of powers. Mr. Jefferson recognized the danger in 1776. I recognize it now. Our Constitution is the supreme law of the land. There is an article stipulating as such. It is not to be changed by ordinary means. It is paramount to the preservation and success of our citizens and our nation. The Constitution, I dare to hope, will ever be a guide to anyone who serves in public office. And when the questions are constantly agitated as to a proper understanding and respect for that document, you will hear much from Mr. Jefferson, who incidentally has yet to write a constitution which is being used by any entity anywhere. I would direct your attentions more to the considerations and opinions of a great friend of Mr. Jefferson, Mr. James Madison of Virginia. He is an eloquent and ardent supporter of a federal union. Mr. Madison is an enlightened advocate for understanding the Constitution as fundamental and paramount law. He would agree that if any ordinary law is passed by any state government which is in conflict with the Constitution, it is null and void. It is no law. And I believe Mr. Madison would agree that when the question arises as to whether a state court or a federal court's finding should be determinative on a federal constitutional question, as Mr. Madison might say, it is the superior practice to defer to the federal courts. I do hope for the future and posterity of Mr. Jefferson that he will pay ever close attention to the advices of his friend, Mr. Madison. Let me allow another personal observation. And again, this is well known to those who are the closest to me. If I were left to consult my own preferences only, I would not be standing here today in the character of the Chief Justice of the United States. I would rather be still in private practice at the bar as an appellate attorney. That has always been my first personal preference. And so I might have been an attorney laboring away in Richmond now, living in a house with my wife and family there, with no further thoughts or cares for public service or obligations, were it not for two people. First, the father of our country. George Washington is an example to all of us. I served as a deputy judge advocate general in his army at Valley Forge, and I served in the field as a commissioned officer in Continental Line. His clear example, never quitting the field, never resigning, never going home on extended leaves, but staying in the field with the Army, was a great help to us. And even more amazing, a gesture which I think commanded the attention and respect of the world. What did General Washington do at the conclusion of our War of Independence? Resigned his commission, put the sword aside, and went home to private life. Here is a man that can be trusted with power. For when you give him power, he will use it for the purposes it was granted, and then he will return it to no injury of the public good. It was easy for me to stand in the House of Representatives when we got reliable news that General Washington at length had passed away at Mount Vernon. And with permission of General Lighthorse Harry Lee, one of Washington's closest friends, I spoke in eulogy written by Lighthorse Harry on the floor of the House that assuredly Washington was first in war, first in peace, first in the hearts of his countrymen. May it ever be so. He is the reason that I stand before you as the Chief Justice. I will give you some small particulars. I had spent a long time abroad as a minister plenipotentiary to France in the 1790s at the behest of President Adams. And there were difficult conditions. I will not relate all the injustices and insults the French government offered to our nation at that time. Our mission was to seek an accommodation with France and return with honor and peace. This was not to be so. And once I got back to our own country, I resolved never to put myself in public life again, to return to my private practice. And when I got to Richmond, fine things were said as to my conduct when I was abroad, and my closest friends consistently urged upon me that I should stand for Congress in the next election. My answer was peremptory. I would not do so. And I had pledged my support to one of my own friends who was willing to run for office. And so I thought the matter settled. I would remain a lawyer in private practice for the rest of my life. An invitation shortly came from Mr. Washington that perhaps I might come and see him at Mount Vernon for several days. I accepted the invitation, and he treated me to some of the most remarkable and extraordinary conversations I have ever had. He pressed upon me the need for public service, for men who were yet young in years, unlike himself, to carry forward with true American principles to safeguard the blessings of our revolution. He asked me to stand for Congress, and I pleaded my case, all the weighty arguments which had successfully kept me out of the contest in Richmond, and he defeated them one by one. His most telling argument, Mr. Marshall, there are times in the affairs of nations that private concerns must be set aside for the public good. We are now in one of those times. Look at my own conduct, General Washington said. He had publicly announced his retirement from public life. Repeatedly, he had gone back to his farm, and yet now, if there was to be a new war with France, he was pledged again to take to the field as our commander-in-chief and defend ourselves on the battlefield. That was his conduct. Mr. Marshall, he said, looking directly at me with his blue eyes in a searching manner, what might I expect from you? I yielded to his representations and became a candidate for Congress. And you know the rest. Member of Congress in the House, then Secretary of State under President Adams, who I still hold in very high regard, notwithstanding his electoral defeat to Mr. Jefferson. And under rather extraordinary and unexpected circumstances, I owe to Mr. Adams my own nomination as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. I may just mention here in passing that the Senate was not universally in favor of my appointment. There were other favorites to be considered. And in a most dilatory manner, they dallied before confirming my nomination for an entire week. But in the end, it was done. And I will endeavor always never to disappoint my friends and the supporters of genuine American principles. I told you there were two men that have brought me to where I am now. Mentioning first the father of our country, who truly beat his sword into a plowshare and showed that he was not only a soldier, but first and foremost a citizen. The other man was my father, Thomas Marshall. Throughout my young life, was a watchful parent, an affectionate friend. He was my most intelligent companion. I saw in the conduct of my own father a man who taught me bravery in war as an officer, a man who taught me respect for the law as a sheriff in our part of Virginia where we were living, a man who showed me the nobility of public service when he stood for and was elected to our House of Delegates for Virginia. A man who took his natural gifts and assiduously worked to improve them in the absence of an extended formal education. Such a man as my father could not be disappointed in the conduct of his elder son. And I have held him before me as an excellent example of public service. Well, I have been speaking now at some length on a variety of subjects. There is truly a great deal more that might be said. But surrounded as I am now by so many new friends, I am not yet perfectly acquainted with some of your interests and perhaps some of the subjects of curiosity you may have, and I would be very willing to entertain questions from you at this time. And of course, since serving on the Supreme Court is not an elective office, and I thank Providence for that, you need not worry about any electioneering or speechifying on my part. I will speak plainly and truthfully to your questions. Sir,
What word do you have of Jefferson's expedition by William Clark and Meriwether?
we were all, I am sure, greatly relieved about a year ago this time, in the fall of 1806, to learn of the safe arrival of that long-lost expedition in St. Louis. And I think they had lost but only one man in the entire proceedings. And no doubt they have brought back a bountiful harvest of discoveries and scientific information, flora and fauna of this grand new acquisition to our republic, as I would call it, or, if pressed, a well-regulated democracy. Madam.
I wonder, I'd like you to speak from your heart. You admire the frontiersman, his ruggedness, his intelligence, his bravery. And yet, when it came to some decisions that you made that caused him great anguish, great danger, you chose in favor of the land companies that were organized and in the state sections of Virginia, New York, Pennsylvania, that were actually being protected by these frontiersmen.
Forgive me, madam, but I am not yet aware of any such causes brought before the Supreme Court. You may be aware of cases being played out at the state level, but as it comes to the western lands, they are of immeasurable importance to us. And I will tell you the most important reason why. In fact, my father became directly involved in the proper surveying of that part of Virginia now known as Kentucky, and out into the valley of the Ohio. When a man signed up for continental service in the late Revolution, he was paid in continental scrip. What was that worth? Nothing.
He was also paid in land.
That is my point, madam. The one real asset, the one real thanks of his government that the soldier could receive was land bounties based on his time in the army and his rank in the service, ranging from hundreds of acres to, in the case of higher ranking commissioned officers, even thousands of acres. And these men were at liberty to move west, even as my own father did, and many others, or to sell the land in a free mutual transaction, whichever suited their predilections and their personal interests. And given my point of view now, that is as much as I can say as to the western lands, with one additional very important comment. As you know, during the American Revolution, up until the very final closing chapters of that extended war, we were purportedly under the late and not very lamented Articles of Confederation. And yet not all had signed, even under the pressures of fighting a common enemy. The smaller states, Maryland in particular, had refused to sign on to the Articles of Confederation, fearing the hegemony of the larger, powerful states, Virginia being the most obvious example. I think when the American Revolution began, I can't be certain, but perhaps as many as 1 in 5 Americans were living in Virginia. We had that vast land claim out to the Ohio. What's to be done? Towards the end of the war, the government of Virginia made it plain to the federal government that she was willing to cede that expansive territory to the Congress. We would ask to be recompensed for some incidental expenses in having settled it and surveyed it and secured it, but it would be of an immeasurable benefit to the new national government to receive those lands. And they were given on the express proviso, as I hope you all remember, that the lands given were not to be kept in perpetual status as some unorganized territory, but in the fullness of time it was expected that they would be properly organized and then ultimately admitted into our new union as states with the equal rights and prerogatives and sovereignty as the existing states. And so it has proven to be in our recent history. For now we have Tennessee and Ohio to join Kentucky and Vermont. And with this enlargement of our federal union, the Congress earlier this year has passed a statute to add an additional justice to the Supreme Court. So when we go back to sit in February of next year, we will have for the first time 7 justices, reflecting the growth of our nation. And in that respect, Madam, being a larger nation now, as we have learned through the recent acquisition of the Louisiana Territory, now there is an example of a chief executive, Mr. Jefferson, who so favored the fortunes and future of our nation that on that occasion, at least, he was willing to completely abandon his own tightly woven political philosophies and spacious principles and act like a pragmatic statesman and secure the property. There was nothing in the Constitution that prohibited such a transaction. There were things in Mr. Jefferson's mind that might have denied us a transaction which will have incalculable effect upon the future of our union. Sir. As am I. Yes and yes. I have served as Grand Master in the Masonic Lodge in Richmond, and we have a reasonably respectable-looking weatherboard building down in one of the lower sections of town, and we have done what we can by that, and I have found it a most agreeable fraternity to be a part of. And to speak even larger to the question, which of course, if you are a Mason, it presupposes your belief in a divine being. And if I ever need any more evidence of the existence of a divine being, I need only look at my own wife, my dearest Polly, who is the fairest creature in all of the country, a woman I am daily blessed to be married to. That, sir, is the evidence of a divine being, her life with me. Indeed, sir. And I have joined almost every organization that offers membership. In candid truth, I can't remember how many organizations I belong to now. But if you organize one, I'm bound to become a member. It is in my nature.
There is word of Jefferson imposing a boycott on products from France and England. What will happen if we can't bring in these products?
Of course, there is the issue of the impressment of American sailors by British men of war on the open oceans. The British Navy evidently intends to continue ruling the waves by sequestering the finest of our own sailors from our merchant vessels. They see that might makes right on the open ocean. If ever there was an argument to sustain the concept of a strong federal union, it is the argument that in the absence of such a union, we shall never be taken seriously by foreign powers. It is, I think, dangerous to recollect that when our own president, Mr. Jefferson, speaks of domestic governments and of foreign governments, he is referring to state governments vis-a-vis the federal government. When I speak of foreign governments, I speak of England, or Great Britain, to be proper, and of France. And now Mr. Jefferson finds himself in an imbroglio. This proposed embargo, since we cannot get satisfaction from the British for fair treatment of our own sailors, since the French, jealous of English advantages, have taken to seizing our ships and our cargoes in French ports and otherwise, Mr. Jefferson decides we will trade with no one. Is that the import, as you understand it, of this new statute that's coming out? Well, there are critics of this because it is going to have extreme and consequential effects upon the economy of this country. You can imagine it shall have strong effects. I don't long wonder before the thousands of people who labor in the ports will find this most distasteful. Have you stopped to consider, sir, if you take the word embargo and you spell it backwards, what do you have? Oh, grab me. The fullness of time will teach us the consequences of such a policy, and I will say two more things on it. I dare hope that if the New England states of our union begin to suffer heavily in consequence of such a doctrine, and I have every reason to think they will, I dare hope they will not become so carried away in their discontent that they will contrive to remove themselves from our union. This would be a horrible calamity. And this is not an idle fear. Where was Shays' rebellion? Yes. Do you realize, right before we established our federal constitution, that Daniel Shays' rebellion prevented the Supreme Court of his state from meeting, that armed mobs were preventing the meeting of the local courts in that distracted Commonwealth, and that there were armed mobs marching on legislatures demanding certain laws be passed, carrying weapons in their hands. This is no idle threat to imagine a growing discontent in New England in response to the Embargo Act. And one other point. I have spoken to you just now in my capacity as an individual private citizen. I can have no such opinions whatsoever to guide me if ever this act should come before the courts. Because let me stress again, it is not the responsibility or the duty of the judiciary to settle political questions. That is outside the scope of our branch. It is our duty to decide individual cases at law. We may pronounce upon the constitutionality of a statute, but we cannot pronounce upon its political merit. That is for our elected lawmakers and our elected executive to see to. Sir, I believe I've been told you have been or are in private practice? Are you?
No, I'm not.
Oh. You look like a lawyer. Ritchie, Mr. Thomas Ritchie. I hope you won't miss the next meeting of our barbecue club.
I have a question about your decision in the Aaron Burr case.
Ah, yes, of recent memory.
It seems to me that this was the most timid kind of prosecution. Aaron Burr was involved in a vast conspiracy, and you did very little to bring forth through the prosecution, who were your friends, the prosecution so that the two witnesses would be present.
Now,
And I have two other questions.
well, let's take the first one.
Let me ask these questions.
I may not keep track of the other two.
Number one,
Let's address the first.
feel maybe you were a bit prejudiced because of your hatred of your cousin Thomas Jefferson. And did you not attend a cocktail party in which all the celebrities of Richmond were present, including Aaron Burr?
How much time do we have?
5 minutes.
Well, let us see what might be done. Mr. Ritchie is a member of the well-known barbecue club in Richmond, and he well knows that when we meet together under the festive board on summer Saturdays, we have 3 rules that govern our conversation. We can speak of anything except for politics, business, and religion. And so he has chosen this opportunity, when he is under no such obligations, to fire away on the topics of the day, as any newspaper editor might be expected to do. Well, now, let us try those 3 questions on their merits individually. The first, a timid prosecution? Let us speak to that. You have compelled me to offer evidence on that point. What does it say for our dedication to due process of law that our sitting president, Mr. Jefferson, found it both convenient and proper to issue a public printed presidential proclamation to Congress stating that the guilt of Aaron Burr was beyond doubt, and making that available before the grand jury even met to decide whether or not Burr should be indicted for treason. And what does it say also? For there were many friends in that court, that the chief prosecuting attorney, the son-in-law of James Monroe, who is a perfect acolyte from Mr. Jefferson, that the prosecuting attorney, George Hay, as I have it on reliable authority, received a large bundle of blank presidential pardons signed by Mr. Jefferson with the instructions that he, Mr. Hay, should feel at perfect liberty to distribute those pardons however he best saw fit in order to advance the prosecution. And as to friends in court, the jury that sat in judgment at the trial, virtually every man on that jury, with only perhaps one or two exceptions, was a known Jeffersonian Republican in their political opinions. A jury very friendly to the philosophies and doctrines of my cousin, Mr. Jefferson. Now, do I hold Jefferson in high regard and with friendly embrace? I fear that my conduct cannot be described towards him as being any better than his conduct towards me. He looks with an ill will upon a federal judiciary, and I think he has deep designs on the future of the court, which may not argue well for the future of a well-regulated democracy dedicated to the rule of law and the separation of powers. But the fullness of time will tell this. And the future will tell us how well we may succeed or fail as a nation, based on how willing Mr. Jefferson is to follow that most laudable example of our late President Washington and refuse to run for a third term. We shall see. And then, have we left anything out of the 3 points? Oh, yes. Yes. The Jeffersonian press lost no opportunity to expatiate at great length upon a social gathering. Anyone who knows me knows that I almost don't need an invitation to appear at any social gathering. It is my nature. And even before the case was brought, my good friend and my close neighbor, Mr. John Wickham, and I were in the routine habit of inviting one another over for dinner parties. And in fact, as you well know, we, Mr. Wickham and I, are the two primary caterers for the Saturday Barbecue Club activities on the west end of Richmond, which you have graced our meetings with, your presence on many occasions. You are a dues-paying member, as you know. Well, Mr. Wickham, as was his custom, long-standing, invited me to come to his house for a dinner party. And was my custom, I accepted. Once I arrived, what should I find but not only the usual gathering of friends and neighbors and colleagues, but as you point out, the defendant, Mr. Burr. Well, I could not help but feel the impropriety of the circumstances. So, I limited my socializing. I stayed much shorter on that occasion than I would have normally done, made my excuses, and came back to my house. And what is more important, it had no influence whatsoever in my judicial conduct in the unfolding of the case. And in the end, it was the jury that made the determination, not me. Sir, we must always follow the path of duty, as Cicero has said to his own son in his famous letters. We must always follow the path of duty. I think he says we should never swerve from the path of duty, even when it may become a little bit rugged from time to time. Gentlemen, ladies, I suppose tempus fugit, time is flying. I have a nod here from a gentleman in more authority than I possess at this gathering, and so I will defer to his authority and again extend to you my profound thanks and my sincere sense of obligation and honor to have been present at these proceedings. Thank you again. Pleasure.
Bravo. Well, Mr. Ritchie, did you like the answers to your questions? Did you like the answers to your questions, Mr. Ritchie? Are you going to write a retraction in your paper? Okay. Never mind. I want to thank our interpreter, who did a magnificent job of displaying the qualities of the great John Marshall. And if you want to know more about him, of course, his name is Mark Greeno. He's the historian of the capital of Virginia, in Richmond. And I would call your attention to the back of your program, which gives a brief bio about him. And we appreciate him coming. Now, we already had one fire. I was afraid of that. I don't know where it went. But let me get on with it before the rest of them fire away. For our last event this evening, we are continuing a tradition that we introduced last year at the John Marshall Dinner. On occasions such as this, then and now, it was customary to give a toast in the name of the honoree. And that is what we propose to do tonight with your help. You should have a bottle of sparkling. I'm going to get out of the way. Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes, all right? What I was going to say, and I don't think it's necessary, was that we're going to ask somebody at every table to pop a cork, but I think they're already popping. So as soon as we all get a bottle of wine, the wine, by the way, is a wine that Thomas Jefferson and George Washington and John Marshall all thoroughly enjoyed. It was produced, as it said in your program there we go, by Benedictine monks. It's about 450 years old in its early development. And it was a wine that our man Jefferson and Marshall enjoyed. Has everybody's cork popped? Has everybody's cork popped? Okay. Now, somebody at the table, please serve the wine before this turns into a disaster. Now, if everybody has a glass, I would now... Not everybody has it? Now you got it? Has everybody got a glass? Okay. It's now my pleasure to present again our president, Dr. Kopp, who will give the annual toast to John Marshall.
The indomitable quest for truth was embodied in how he lived his life. A man of and for the people, his service to this nation as Chief Justice, and the exquisitely reasoned opinions he penned for the court, created a defining and enduring legacy for this nation. Truly the definer of the Constitution, we toast our namesake, John Marshall, on the occasion of his 254th birthday, true patriot, unrivaled jurist, and loving family man. Wherever you are, John Marshall, sit back and listen to posterity's praise. May we emulate your example in all that we do each and every day. Hear, hear. To you, John.
Of 1789, when Congress passed the Federal Judiciary Act. And so the practical import of what I have just said is that the Supreme Court of the United States was born as an institution on the same date in September as I was born as an individual mortal. And although the anniversary of my birth is of immediate interest to myself and a close circle of friends and family, I dare to hope that the birth of the Supreme Court of this American nation will be of far surpassing and enduring consequence to generations yet unborn. So I give you, gentlemen and ladies, the Supreme Court of the United States.
Hear, hear.
Hear, hear.
Well, Judge, I have one last thing to do. If I can find it, it's something I know you will enjoy, and I hope you carry it back to Old Virginia with you. It is a fine bottle of Madeira wine. Would you please come forward?
The hand of Providence is visibly displayed. Outstanding. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Well, that's our program. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you so much for enjoying the evening with us and with meeting, of course, the great Chief Justice, John Marshall. Good night.